The pills rattled softly against the plastic bottle as Helen's wheelchair bumped over another uneven stone. 30 OxyContin tablets, enough to finally silence the voice in her head that whispered, "You should have died instead every waking moment for the past 3 years." She paused near a weathered fountain where pilgrims had been tossing coins since before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. The water reflected the overcast sky, grey as her mood, grey as the Portuguese mountains that surrounded this forgotten corner of the world. Helen had chosen this place carefully, far from Paris, far from the ballet studios where she'd once been destined for greatness, far from the intersection where everything had gone so horribly wrong. A group of elderly women shuffled past, their black shawls making them look like a murder of crows. They clutched rosary beads and whispered prayers in Portuguese, probably asking for healing for arthritis or heart conditions, the ordinary ailments of ordinary lives. Helen envied them their simple faith, their belief that touching an old statue could somehow fix what was broken inside them. The Virgin Mary statue stood in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by a semicircle of stone benches worn smooth by centuries of faithful visitors. She was smaller than Helen had expected, maybe 6 feet tall, carved from what looked like local granite that had weathered to the color of old bones. The Virgin's face gazed downward with an expression that seemed almost sad, as if she understood the weight of every desperate prayer that had ever been whispered in her presence. Helen's phone buzzed. A text from her mother called your hotel. "They said you checked out? Where are you, ma chérie?" She turned the phone face down without responding. Maman had suffered enough, losing one daughter in the accident, then watching the other slowly disappear into grief and guilt. At least after today, the wondering would stop. The phone calls to therapists would stop. The desperate attempts to coax Helen back to life would finally, mercifully stop. A young priest emerged from the small chapel attached to the sanctuary, his dark robes swishing as he walked. He nodded politely at Helen before settling onto one of the stone benches with a worn breviary. She wondered if he'd ever actually witnessed a miracle here, or if he just went through the motions, blessing pilgrims and collecting donations while secretly doubting that God was listening to any of them. The bottle in her pocket seemed to grow heavier as she wheeled closer to the statue. Up close, she could see the details that photographs never captured. The delicate folds of the Virgin's stone robes, the way her outstretched hand had been polished smooth by countless desperate touches, the small chips and imperfections that made her seem almost human. Just get it over with, Helen told herself. Touch the hand, say goodbye to Claire, take the pills. But as she positioned her wheelchair beside the statue, something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way the morning light was beginning to break through the clouds, casting strange shadows across the courtyard. Maybe it was the sound of distant church bells echoing off the mountains. Or maybe it was the sudden, irrational feeling that she was being watched by more than just the stone Virgin's sightless eyes. She glanced around the courtyard. The priest was absorbed in his prayers. The elderly women had moved on to light candles in the chapel. A few other pilgrims wandered the grounds, but none seemed to be paying attention to the girl in the wheelchair who was about to commit the greatest sin of all. Helen reached into her pocket and felt the smooth plastic of the pill bottle one more time. In a few hours she'd be with Claire again. No more physiotherapy sessions that led nowhere. No more pitying looks from former classmates who remembered when Helen Moreau was going to dance at the Paris Opera. No more dreams where she could still feel her legs, only to wake up to the crushing reality of paralyzed limbs and a half-empty life. The Virgin's outstretched hand was just inches away now. Helen had read that pilgrims had been touching this exact spot since 1623, each one hoping for their own private miracle. What would they think if they knew someone was about to use their sacred statue as part of a suicide ritual? "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to God, to her sister, or to her mother, who would have to identify her body in a foreign country. Helen reached forward, her fingertips just grazing the cool stone surface of the Virgin's palm. The sensation was oddly electric, like touching a doorknob after walking across carpet, but she dismissed it as nerves. She pressed her palm fully against the statue's hand and closed her eyes. "Goodbye, Claire. I'm finally coming to find you." The pills rattled one last time as she reached for the bottle, but something was wrong. The electric sensation was spreading up her arm, and suddenly the courtyard around her felt charged with an energy that made her skin crawl and her heart race. Helen jerked her hand back from the statue as if she'd been burned. The electric sensation faded immediately, leaving only the familiar numbness in her legs and the rapid hammering of her heart. She stared at the Virgin's weathered face, searching for some explanation, but the stone features remained as impassive as ever. "Just nerves," she told herself, though her hand was still tingling. "You're psyching yourself out." The priest looked up from his breviary, his dark eyes meeting hers across the courtyard. For a moment Helen thought he might approach, ask if she needed help, offer some platitude about God's plan, but he simply nodded and returned to his prayers. She envied his certainty, the way he could sit there reading ancient words and believe they meant something beyond the comfort of routine. Helen's phone buzzed again. Another text from her mother, then another. She could picture Maman pacing their apartment in the 16th arrondissement, probably calling every hospital in Lisbon by now. Margot Moreau had always been a woman of action. When the twins were born premature, she'd practically lived at the NICU for 2 months. When Claire showed early signs of dyslexia, Maman had hired 3 different specialists before Claire was even 7, and when Helen's legs were crushed in the accident, Maman had researched every experimental treatment, every promising therapy, every miracle cure she could find. The irony wasn't lost on Helen that her mother had actually suggested this pilgrimage 6 months ago, not as a religious experience, the Moreaus were Catholic in name only, but as a change of scenery, a chance for Helen to find some peace outside the walls of their Parisian apartment. Helen had laughed bitterly at the suggestion then. Now she was here, just not for the reasons her mother had hoped. The morning sun was climbing higher, and more pilgrims were beginning to arrive. An elderly man with a pronounced limp made his way slowly toward the statue, his face creased with the kind of pain that comes from years of bearing weight on damaged joints. Behind him, a middle-aged woman guided a young boy who couldn't have been more than 10, his head wrapped in a colorful scarf that couldn't quite hide the telltale baldness of chemotherapy. Helen watched them approach with a mixture of pity and resentment. These people still had hope. They still believed that touching a piece of carved stone could somehow rewrite the fundamental laws of medicine and physics. She envied them that delusion, even as it disgusted her. The old man reached the statue first, his gnarled hands trembling as he placed them against the Virgin's outstretched palm. His lips moved in silent prayer, and Helen could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. When he finally stepped away, the woman and her son took his place. The boy looked embarrassed by the whole ritual, but he dutifully pressed his small hand against the stone, while his mother whispered urgently in Portuguese. None of them experienced what Helen had, that strange electric charge, the feeling that something was stirring to life beneath her touch. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, except for the fact that her palm still tingled where it had made contact with the stone. Her phone rang this time instead of buzzing. Maman's face smiled up from the screen, a photo from last Christmas taken during one of Helen's rare good days when she'd managed to smile for the camera. Helen let it go to voicemail, then immediately felt the familiar stab of guilt. After today, her mother would replay every missed call, every ignored text, looking for signs she should have recognized. The truth was, there had been signs. Helen had been giving things away for weeks. Her ballet shoes to a young dancer at her old studio, her favorite books to the hospital library where she'd spent so many months in rehabilitation. She'd written letters too, though she'd been careful not to make them sound like goodbyes. Just random thoughts, memories of better times, expressions of love disguised as casual correspondence. The bottle of pills seemed to pulse in her pocket like a second heartbeat. She'd been planning this for months, researching dosages and methods with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to perfecting her grand jetés. The OxyContin would be peaceful, No violence, no mess for some poor stranger to clean up, just a slow drift into unconsciousness, then nothing. Except now, sitting here in this ancient courtyard with the Virgin's stone eyes gazing down at her, Helen found herself thinking about Claire in a way she hadn't in years. Not the Claire who died in the twisted metal of their father's BMW, but the Claire who used to sneak into Helen's room during thunderstorms, who always insisted on splitting the last piece of chocolate exactly in half, who would whisper jokes during boring family dinners until both twins were shaking with suppressed laughter. What would Claire think about this plan? Would she understand, or would she be furious that Helen was throwing away the life they should have shared? The questions felt dangerous, like cracks forming in the careful wall of numbness Helen had built around her heart. She couldn't afford doubt now, not when she was so close to finally ending 3 years of guilt and pain and endless, empty tomorrows. She reached for the pills again, but her hand hesitated over the bottle as the electric memory of touching the statue flickered through her fingers once more. Helen's fingers had just closed around the pill bottle when she heard it. A low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The elderly man who'd been praying at the statue looked up sharply, his rheumy eyes scanning the clear morning sky. The woman with her sick son grabbed the boy's hand protectively, pulling him closer. The rumble grew louder, deeper, until Helen could feel it vibrating through the stone courtyard and up into her wheelchair. It wasn't thunder. The sound was too steady, too purposeful, more like the earth itself was clearing its throat. Meu Deus, whispered the priest, his breviary falling forgotten to the ground. He was staring upward, his face pale in the strengthening sunlight. Helen followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The sun, which had been a normal bright disk moments before, now had a dark bite taken out of its edge. As she watched, transfixed, the shadow crept steadily across the solar surface like some cosmic predator devouring light itself. Eclipse, she whispered, the word feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. She'd read about this, a total solar eclipse visible from this exact region of Portugal. But the timing was supposed to be hours away, during the afternoon when she'd planned to be long gone from this world. The other pilgrims had noticed now. More were emerging from the chapel, pointing at the sky and crossing themselves. An old woman began praying loudly in Portuguese, her voice rising in pitch as the shadow consumed more of the sun. The air itself seemed to be dimming, taking on an otherworldly quality that made Helen's skin prickle. The pill bottle slipped from her fingers and clattered to the cobblestones. As she bent to retrieve it, Helen's gaze fell on the Virgin Mary statue, and her heart nearly stopped. The weathered stone surface was beginning to glow, not with reflected light, but with something that seemed to emanate from within the granite itself, a soft, pearl-like luminescence that grew stronger as the eclipse progressed. "Do you see that?" she called out to the priest. But he was already moving toward the statue with an expression of wonder and terror that suggested he'd never witnessed anything like this in all his years of service. The electric sensation Helen had felt earlier was back, but stronger now, crackling through the air like invisible lightning. Every hair on her arms stood up, and she could taste copper on her tongue. Around the courtyard, other pilgrims were backing away from the statue, some crying, others falling to their knees in prayer. But Helen found herself rolling forward instead of retreating. The glow was mesmerizing, pulsing gently like a heartbeat made of light. And there was something else, a sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite voice, threading through the air so softly that Helen wasn't sure if she was hearing it or feeling it in her bones. It reminded her of something, a melody she'd danced to once, long ago. Claire's favorite song, the one they'd practiced their first pas de deux to when they were only 8 years old. Helen's rational mind screamed at her to wheel away, to grab her pills and find somewhere private to finish what she'd started. This was exactly the kind of religious hysteria she'd come here to avoid, desperate people seeing miracles in natural phenomena, convincing themselves that coincidence was divine intervention. But her body wasn't listening to her rational mind. Her hands were already propelling her wheelchair closer to the statue drawn by something she couldn't name and didn't understand. The eclipse was nearly total now. The world had taken on the eerie twilight of a storm that never breaks, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. In the strange half-light, the Virgin's glowing form seemed almost alive, as if centuries of stone sleep were finally ending. Helen stopped her wheelchair just inches from the statue. This close, the electric sensation was so strong it made her teeth ache. The bottle of pills lay forgotten on the ground behind her, her carefully planned exit seeming suddenly irrelevant in the face of this impossible moment. She could turn around. She could still collect her pills, find a quiet corner of this ancient sanctuary, and slip peacefully into the darkness she'd been craving for 3 years. No one would blame her, a depressed girl overcome by the hysteria of a religious experience. It would almost be poetic. Or she could reach out and touch the statue again, this time when it was blazing with inexplicable light during a solar eclipse that was happening hours ahead of schedule. She could give in to the pull she felt in her chest, the voice that sounded like Claire whispering, "Touch her, touch her, touch her." Helen lifted her trembling hand toward the Virgin's outstretched palm. Above them, the sun disappeared completely behind the moon's shadow, plunging the world into an otherworldly twilight broken only by the statue's impossible glow. She had to choose, pills or miracle, death or mystery. The careful plan she'd crafted in her darkest moments, or this terrifying leap into the unknown. Around her, the assembled pilgrims held their breath, as if the world itself was waiting for her decision. Helen's hand hovered in the air between decision and destruction, trembling like a leaf caught in impossible wind. The Virgin's glowing palm waited mere inches away, but those inches might as well have been an ocean. Her fingers cramped from holding the same position, muscles locked in paralysis that had nothing to do with the accident and everything to do with the weight of choice. What if it's real? The thought crept through her carefully constructed walls of cynicism like water through cracks. What if something actually happens? That was the fear she hadn't anticipated, not that nothing would occur when she touched the statue, but that something would. Something that would shatter the perfect, tragic narrative she'd wrapped around herself like armor for 3 years. Helen Moreau, the broken ballerina. Helen Moreau, the guilty survivor. Helen Moreau, who lost everything that mattered in twisted metal and shattered glass. If she touched this impossible glowing stone and felt nothing, she could retrieve her pills with her worldview intact. Science would remain science. Grief would remain manageable through pharmaceutical intervention. The neat conclusion she'd planned would still be waiting. But if she touched it, and something did happen— "Claire!" she whispered, the name barely audible above the cosmic symphony surrounding them. "What am I supposed to do?" The memory hit her like a physical blow. Claire's voice from the night before the accident, excited and breathless over the phone. "Helen, I found something. About the scholarship, about why you didn't get it. We need to talk before—" The call had cut out. Bad reception in the countryside where Claire had been visiting their cousin. Helen had been annoyed at the interruption, had fallen asleep before Claire could call back. She'd never learned what Claire wanted to tell her. A sob escaped Helen's throat as the weight of that unfinished conversation pressed against her chest. 3 years of guilt, of wondering if Claire had been trying to warn her about something, if there had been signs she'd missed. The official report said their father had fallen asleep at the wheel during the drive to pick Helen up from dance practice, but Claire's call suggested something else, something left forever unsaid in the silence of death. The statue's glow pulsed brighter, and Helen felt that electric sensation coursing up her still extended arm. Around her, she could hear the whispered prayers of other pilgrims growing more urgent, their Portuguese words blending into a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. The priest's voice rose above them, calling out what sounded like the beginning of last rites. "They think I'm dying," Helen realized. "They think this is my final moment." They weren't entirely wrong. Whether she touched the statue or turned away to find her pills, Helen Moreau, as she had existed for the past 3 years, was about to end. The question was what would take her place, nothing, or something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her mother's face flashed through her mind. Maman's expression during those early days in the hospital when the doctors explained that Helen would never walk again. Margot Moreau had absorbed the news with the same steely determination she'd always brought to impossible challenges, immediately researching physical therapists and adaptive equipment and experimental procedures. She'd never once suggested that Helen's life was over, even when Helen had screamed that exact sentiment during those first dark months. She's probably boarding a plane right now, Helen thought, picturing her mother's frantic preparations to fly to Portugal and retrieve her missing daughter. She'll blame herself for not stopping me. The guilt of that realization warred with the exhaustion that had driven Helen here in first place. How many more years could she pretend to recover, to improve, to find meaning in a half-life that felt like wearing clothes that would never quite fit? How many more times could she endure well, meaning friends visiting with careful smiles and determined cheerfulness, treating her like a fragile thing that might break if they mentioned dancing or running or any of the thousand simple freedoms her legs had once provided? But beneath those familiar thoughts, something else stirred. A curiosity she'd thought had died with Claire, awakened by the impossible scene surrounding her. What's this light? Why was the eclipse happening hours early, and why did touching the statue feel like completing some circuit she hadn't known was broken? The questions felt dangerous, like the first tentative steps of someone learning to walk again. They suggested a future that extended beyond this courtyard, beyond this moment of choosing between pills and miracle. They whispered of mysteries to be solved and truths to be discovered, of a world still capable of surprise even for someone who thought she'd seen all the cruelty it could offer. Helen's hand drifted closer to the Virgin's palm, drawn by forces she couldn't name. The electric sensation intensified until it felt like her entire arm was humming with potential energy. Above them, the eclipsed sun created a corona of light around the moon's shadow, and Helen realized she was about to step off the edge of everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the space between them. The choice was no longer between living and dying. It was between the known darkness and the unknowable light. Helen pressed her palm against the Virgin's glowing stone hand. The world exploded into sensation, not pain, something far more overwhelming than mere physical agony. Every nerve in her body that had been silent for 3 years suddenly screamed back to life, flooding her consciousness with signals she'd forgotten the body could produce. But it wasn't just her own nervous system awakening. Images crashed through her mind like a dam bursting, memories that belonged to someone else entirely. Claire, 17 years old, discovering a folder of documents in their father's study. Bank statements showing payments to someone named Marcus Delacroix, phone records revealing calls to numbers Claire didn't recognize. Her sister's voice, urgent and frightened. "Helen, the scholarship, it wasn't merit-based. Papa paid them to reject you. And there's more, so much more." Helen tried to pull her hand away, but her palm seemed fused to the stone. The electric sensation had become a torrent of energy flowing between her body and the statue, and she could feel something fundamental shifting in the architecture of her spine. Impossible warmth spread down through her torso, following pathways that medical science had declared permanently severed. Claire again, older now, making the phone call Helen remembered. But this time Helen experienced it from her sister's perspective, felt Claire's racing pulse and growing terror. "He knows I found the files. Helen, I think Papa's been stealing from the company, and the scholarship thing was just the beginning. If I'm right about what these numbers mean," the line crackling with interference that wasn't interference at all, but someone cutting the call. The memories weren't visions or dreams. They were lived experiences, complete with emotions and sensations that belonged to Claire's consciousness. Helen could feel her dead sister's mounting horror as pieces of their father's deception crystallized into a pattern too terrible to ignore. Embezzlement from his own company, bribes to judges in Helen's dance competitions, a web of corruption that Claire had stumbled into purely by accident. Around Helen, the pilgrims' voices had risen to a fevered crescendo, but their words seemed to come from another universe. The only reality was the flood of impossible sensation coursing through her body and the rush of memories that weren't hers to remember. The accident itself, but not as Helen had experienced it from the passenger seat. This was Claire's perspective from the back of their father's BMW, watching Papa's hands steady and deliberate on the wheel as he aimed for the bridge abutment. Not falling asleep, choosing. Claire's realization in the final seconds that their father would rather kill all three of them than face exposure. Her desperate lunge forward to grab the wheel, the impact throwing her sideways as she screamed Helen's name. Helen's legs were burning now, not with pain, but with the impossible return of sensation. She could feel her toes, her calves, muscles that had been dead weight for 3 years, suddenly remembering their purpose. But the physical miracle was secondary to the crushing weight of understanding flooding her consciousness. Their father hadn't fallen asleep at the wheel. He'd tried to murder both his daughters to protect his secrets. And somehow, Claire's memories of that truth had been waiting here in this statue for 3 years, suspended in stone like insects in amber, waiting for Helen to claim them. More memories now, rushing past in a torrent of sensation. Claire's childhood fears that their father loved Helen more, her secret relief when Helen's scholarship was rejected, followed immediately by crushing guilt. The discovery that Papa had orchestrated the rejection and that he'd been manipulating both their lives in ways they'd never suspected. Helen could feel her wheelchair beneath her, but also something else, the possibility of standing. The burning sensation in her legs had become a symphony of awakening nerves, each one singing back to life with impossible intensity. Part of her mind catalogued this miracle with clinical detachment, complete spinal cord regeneration, unprecedented in medical literature. But the larger part of her consciousness was drowning in the terrible gift of her sister's final memories. Claire's last coherent thought as the car crumpled around them. Not fear for her own death, but desperate hope that Helen would survive to expose what their father had done. The statue's glow was dimming now, or perhaps Helen's vision was overwhelmed by tears she didn't remember crying. The electric connection was fading, but something had been permanently transferred. Not just the return of sensation to her paralyzed body, but the complete archive of her sister's consciousness in the weeks before her death. Helen finally managed to pull her hand away from the stone, gasping as if she'd been underwater for hours. The eclipse was ending overhead, normal sunlight beginning to creep back across the courtyard. The assembled pilgrims stared at her with expressions ranging from terror to awe, but Helen barely saw them. She placed both hands on the arms of her wheelchair and, for the first time in 3 years, stood up. Her legs shook with the effort, muscles remembering strength they'd lost, but they held. She was standing, she was whole, she was alive, and she finally understood that everything she'd believed about the accident, about her father, about Claire's death, about her own survival, had been a lie. The real mystery was just beginning. The miracle of standing lasted exactly 17 seconds before Helen's overwhelmed nervous system betrayed her. She collapsed back into her wheelchair, legs trembling with the memory of sensation that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The assembled pilgrims pressed closer, their excited Portuguese washing over her like an incomprehensible tide. "Milagre! Milagre!" The word rippled through the crowd, but Helen barely heard it. Claire's memories were still cascading through her consciousness, 3 years of suppressed truth demanding attention all at once. Miss, are you hurt?" The priest appeared at her side, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over her shoulders. Father Antonio, she remembered from his earlier introduction, though it felt like hours ago instead of minutes. "What you experienced, it is unprecedented in our records." Helen tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, as if she'd been screaming. When words finally came, they emerged as a whisper. "My sister, she's in my head." The priest's expression shifted from wonder to concern. "You are in shock. This is natural after such an event. But you stood, I saw you stand. The others saw. You don't understand." Helen grabbed his wrist with desperate strength. "She's there. Claire's memories. The accident. It wasn't an accident. A new voice cut through the crowd's excitement, speaking English with crisp authority. "Father Antonio, I need to speak with this young woman immediately." Helen looked up to see an elderly man pushing through the pilgrims with practiced ease. Tall and lean, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place among the simple clothes of the other visitors, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having crowds part before him. "Dr. Carvalho," the priest said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you are here. This girl, she has experienced something extraordinary, but I fear I know exactly what she's experienced." Dr. Carvalho crouched beside Helen's wheelchair, studying her with pale blue eyes that seemed to see too much. "Miss Moreau, isn't it? Helen Moreau from Marseille, 19 years old, paralyzed in a car accident that killed her twin sister." The casual recitation of her personal details sent ice through Helen's veins. "How do you know who I am?" "Because I've been waiting for you to come here." His smile was gentle, but there was something unsettling beneath its surface. "Or someone like you. The statue calls to certain types of trauma, you see. Twins who've lost their other half, parents who've lost children, lovers separated by sudden death. But you're special, Miss Moreau. You're the first to survive direct contact during an eclipse manifestation." Helen's hands tightened on her wheelchair's armrests. "Eclipse manifestation?" "The phenomenon occurs roughly every 18 months, always during solar eclipses that appear hours before astronomical predictions suggest they should. The statue becomes a conduit, a bridge between the living and the memories of the dead." Dr. Carvalho gestured toward the Virgin Mary, whose stone surface had returned to ordinary granite. "Most people who touch her during these events experience cardiac arrest from the neural overload. You not only survived, but integrated the transferred consciousness." The crowd around them had grown larger, pressing closer with phones raised to capture video of the girl who had stood up from her wheelchair. Helen could hear multiple languages now: Portuguese, Spanish, what sounded like German. Word was spreading beyond the sanctuary walls. "Transferred consciousness?" Helen's voice cracked on the words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, my dear, that your sister's memories didn't die with her body. They were preserved here, waiting for the right moment and the right recipient." Dr. Carvalho's eyes gleamed with scientific fascination. "You're carrying Claire's complete neural patterns now. Every memory, every emotion, every secret she died trying to share." Helen thought of Claire's final moments, the terrible knowledge of their father's betrayal flooding through her borrowed memories. "But that's impossible. People don't just... Memories aren't..." "Aren't what? Aren't transferable?" Dr. Carvalho stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "Neither is spontaneous spinal cord regeneration, yet here you are with feeling in your legs. The sanctuary operates by rules that modern science hasn't caught up to yet." Father Antonio stepped forward, wringing his hands. "Doctor, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. The crowds are about to become our biggest problem." Dr. Carvalho agreed. "Miss Moreau, I'm afraid your miracle has made you quite visible to people who would rather keep this sanctuary's true nature hidden. You have perhaps an hour before very dangerous individuals arrive to assess whether you represent an opportunity or a threat." Helen's mind reeled. "What kind of individuals?" "The kind who have been harvesting memories from the statue for decades. The kind who killed your sister to protect secrets, and who will certainly kill you to protect much bigger ones." Dr. Carvalho extended his hand. "I can offer you protection and answers, but only if you trust me." "What will it be?" Helen stared at Dr. Carvalho's outstretched hand, Claire's memories swirling through her consciousness, like a second voice whispering warnings. Through her sister's borrowed recollections, she could feel the paranoia that had consumed Claire's final weeks, the growing certainty that their father's associates were watching, waiting, ready to silence anyone who threatened their carefully constructed lies. "Trust you?" Helen's laugh came out bitter and raw. 3 minutes ago I thought miracles were fairy tales. Now you're telling me my dead sister's consciousness is hitchhiking in my brain and assassins are coming to clean up loose ends. Why should I trust anyone? The crowd pressed closer, phone still recording, their excited chatter a constant backdrop of anticipation. Helen could see herself through their eyes, the miracle girl, the one who had touched divine grace and walked again. They had no idea they were witnessing the opening moves of something far more dangerous than a simple healing. Because, Dr. Carvalho said quietly, I'm the only person here who isn't surprised by what just happened to you. I've been studying this sanctuary for 20 years, documenting every manifestation, cataloging every memory transfer. I know what you're experiencing because I've helped others through it. Others? Helen's pulse quickened. There are others like me. Fewer than you might think. Most people who achieve full neural integration don't survive long enough to benefit from the knowledge. His pale eyes scanned the crowd with obvious anxiety. The forces that killed your sister have significant resources and very little patience for loose ends. Father Antonio clutched his rosary with trembling fingers. Doctor, surely the church has been looking the other way for centuries. Dr. Carvalho cut him off. Do you think it's coincidence that this sanctuary exists in one of the most remote corners of Portugal, that pilgrimages here are actively discouraged by the Vatican? Your predecessors made deals with devils long before you arrived, Father. Helen felt her legs tingling with renewed sensation, muscles responding to commands that should have been impossible. But even the miracle of her healing felt secondary to the weight of Claire's memories pressing against her thoughts. She could access them now, like files on a computer, each recollection complete with emotional context and sensory detail. Claire discovering their father's encrypted communications with Marcus Delacroix. Papa discussing cleanup protocols and acceptable casualties. The growing realization that the family construction business was laundering money for something much larger and more dangerous. The scholarship, Helen whispered, pieces clicking together. Claire said Papa paid them to reject me, but it wasn't about money, was it? Dr. Carvalho's expression sharpened. What do you remember? Not remember. Claire's memories. Helen closed her eyes, letting her sister's consciousness guide her through the labyrinth of evidence. Papa needed me to fail because successful dancers travel. They perform internationally, get media attention. I would have been too visible for what he was planning. And what was he planning? The answer came not from Helen's own deduction, but from Claire's painstaking investigation in those final weeks. To disappear. The whole family. New identities, new country. He'd been skimming construction funds for years, building an escape route. But first he needed to eliminate anyone who knew too much, including his own daughters. Father Antonio crossed himself. Merciful God! To think such evil could reach into this sacred place. This place exists because of such evil, Dr. Carvalho said. Every memory trapped in that statue belongs to someone who died violently, usually to protect the secrets of powerful people. The sanctuary isn't a monument to divine grace. It's a repository of inconvenient truths that someone wanted buried with the dead. Helen's hands clenched into fists as Claire's rage flowed through her. 3 years of suppressed fury finally finding expression. Then why help me? If this place is owned by murderers, why offer protection? Because I've been gathering evidence for decades, waiting for someone who could survive the memory transfer process long enough to testify. You're not just carrying your sister's consciousness, Helen. You're carrying legal proof of an international conspiracy that's been operating for over 30 years. The crowd around them had begun to disperse as the eclipse ended completely, normal afternoon sunlight washing away the supernatural atmosphere. But Helen noticed new faces appearing at the edges of the courtyard, men in dark suits moving with purposeful direction, speaking into concealed microphones. Dr. Carvalho followed her gaze and swore under his breath, "They're early. We need to move now." Move where? Helen's legs still trembled when she tried to stand, her newly awakened nervous system struggling to coordinate complex movements. Somewhere they can't follow. Somewhere the memories in your head can be properly documented before they're silenced forever. He gestured toward a narrow path leading away from the main sanctuary. There's a safe house 20 minutes from here, but we have to go now before... A sharp crack echoed across the courtyard. Father Antonio stumbled backward, his rosary scattering across ancient stones as a dark stain spread across his chest. Helen's scream caught in her throat as Father Antonio collapsed, his weathered hands clutching at the spreading crimson stain across his white vestments. The crowd that had been dispersing moments before erupted into chaos, pilgrims shrieking, phones clattering to stone as people dove for cover behind ancient columns and ornamental bushes. "Sniper!" Dr. Carvalho barked, grabbing the back of Helen's wheelchair. "They're not here to talk." Helen's newly awakened legs tried to obey her panicked instinct to run, but her nervous system betrayed her again. She could feel sensation coursing through muscles that had been dead for 3 years, but coordination remained maddeningly elusive. She was trapped in her chair, a sitting target in an open courtyard while unseen marksmen picked their shots. Another crack split the air. Stone exploded from the Virgin Mary statue's base, exactly where Helen had been sitting minutes earlier. Through Claire's borrowed memories, she recognized the calculated precision. These weren't warning shots. Someone wanted her dead, and they had the equipment to make it happen from distance. The path! Dr. Carvalho shoved her wheelchair toward the narrow trail he'd indicated earlier, but Helen could see dark-suited figures emerging from that direction too. They were surrounded, caught between the main sanctuary, where snipers commanded clear sight lines, and the mountain paths where ground teams waited. "We're cut off!" Helen gasped, her hands slick with sweat on the wheelchair's controls. Claire's memories provided tactical awareness Helen had never possessed. Her sister had spent weeks studying their father's security protocols, learning to think like the people who wanted her dead. They've planned this. They knew we'd try to run. Dr. Carvalho's calm facade cracked. Impossible. I've used this route dozens of times. No one knows about the safe house except... He stopped, comprehension dawning across his features. Christ, they've been watching me too. Helen felt Claire's consciousness surge forward, memories cascading through her mind with crystalline clarity. Not just the accident anymore, but everything that led up to it. Their father's phone calls in languages she didn't recognize. Strange visitors to their house who spoke in careful euphemisms about international partnerships and legacy management. Claire's growing understanding that the construction company was a front for something that spanned continents. And there, a face she recognized among their father's associates. Younger then, but unmistakably the same pale blue eyes now staring down at her with scientific fascination. "You," Helen whispered, the truth hitting her like physical force. "You're one of them." Dr. Carvalho's expression didn't change, but his grip on her wheelchair tightened. I wondered if the memory integration would be complete enough for recognition. Your sister was remarkably observant. Claire saw you, at our house, meeting with Papa. You were part of it from the beginning. Helen's voice carried 3 years of accumulated grief and fury, amplified by Claire's own desperate rage. The sanctuary, the memory transfers, you've been harvesting the dead for them. Harvesting is such an ugly word. Dr. Carvalho stepped around to face her, no longer bothering to maintain his helpful facade. I prefer to think of it as preservation. Do you have any idea how much valuable intelligence dies with people every day? Corporate secrets, government communications, compromising photographs, all lost when the brain stops functioning. This place lets us recover those assets. The shooting had stopped, but Helen could see the suited figures advancing from multiple directions, moving with military precision. Father Antonio lay motionless near the statue, his blood seeping between ancient stones that had probably absorbed similar stains for centuries. My sister died because she found out about your operation. Your sister died because she was curious and careless in equal measure. Dr. Carvalho checked his watch with casual indifference. Though I admit, having her memories manifest in you is an unexpected bonus. Claire documented quite a bit before your father decided she'd become a liability. Helen felt sensation flooding back into her legs with renewed intensity, but this time it wasn't the gentle awakening she'd experienced at the statue. This was her body responding to absolute terror, every dormant nerve firing simultaneously as fight-or-flight instincts overrode 3 years of paralysis. The miracle, she gasped. It wasn't from the statue. You did this to me. A necessary modification. We needed someone who could access Claire's memories and survive the extraction process. His smile was clinical, devoid of warmth. The healing was simply conditioning to ensure your cooperation. Helen tried to stand, her legs shaking with new strength, but Dr. Carvalho produced a small device from his jacket, something that looked like a car key fob. I wouldn't recommend sudden movements. The neural modifications that restored your mobility can be reversed just as easily. The advancing figures were close now, close enough that Helen could see weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Everything Dr. Carvalho had told her about protection and safe houses had been lies designed to isolate her from potential witnesses. The real ordeal wasn't surviving the memory transfer. It was surviving the people who wanted to control what those memories contained. Her greatest fear wasn't death. It was the possibility that Claire's final gift, the truth that had cost her sister's life, would die with them both. Helen's legs gave out beneath her as Dr. Carvalho pressed a button on the device. The sensation that had flooded back through her nervous system vanished instantly, leaving her crashing to the ancient stones with a sickening impact that sent shockwaves through bones that had forgotten how to bear weight. Her wheelchair rolled backward, empty and useless, as she lay sprawled like a broken doll beside the blood-stained courtyard. Fascinating, Dr. Carvalho murmured, making notes on a tablet that appeared from his jacket. The neural pathways respond to wireless suppression even faster than organic paralysis. 3 years of atrophy, undone and redone in minutes. Helen tried to drag herself toward Father Antonio's motionless form, but her arms shook with exhaustion and shock. Claire's memories crashed through her consciousness in fragmented waves, not the organized recollections she'd been able to access before, but chaotic fragments of terror and betrayal. Her sister's final moments, playing out in vivid detail as Helen's own death approached. Claire, in the passenger seat, realizing too late that Papa's hands weren't shaking from emotion but from the sedative he'd injected into his own system. The car accelerating toward the bridge barrier. Claire's desperate attempt to grab the wheel, the terrible understanding that she was meant to die alone, that Helen's absence from the car wasn't coincidence but careful planning. The original plan was much cleaner, Dr. Carvalho continued, circling Helen like a predator examining wounded prey. Your father was supposed to die in that accident too, making it appear like a tragic family loss. But he developed last-minute complications about murdering his children. We had to improvise. The suited figures had formed a perimeter around the courtyard, their weapons now openly displayed. Pilgrims who hadn't fled during the initial shooting cowered behind stone columns, some still recording with their phones despite the obvious danger. Helen realized with growing horror that her miracle and its aftermath would be documented from multiple angles, uploaded to social media, shared across the globe, and then systematically scrubbed from existence by people with the resources to rewrite digital history. Claire found the real financial records, Helen whispered, each word costing tremendous effort. Papa wasn't just laundering money, he was selling construction contracts to build smuggling infrastructure, tunnels, hidden compartments, transportation networks. Your sister was remarkably thorough, Dr. Carvalho agreed. She traced the operation across 7 countries before we realized how much she'd uncovered. By then, elimination became the only viable option. Helen's vision blurred as neurological feedback from the suppression device sent waves of agony through her spine. But Claire's memories remained crystal clear, providing horrible context for everything that followed the accident. the months of rehabilitation that had isolated Helen from friends and normal life, the therapy sessions that were actually intelligence gathering, the carefully orchestrated depression that had driven her towards suicidal thoughts, making her desperate enough to seek miracles in remote Portuguese sanctuaries. "You've been planning this for 3 years," she realized. "The guilt, the despair, driving me to come here. You needed me broken enough to touch the statue during an eclipse." "We needed you motivated enough to complete the memory transfer," he corrected. "Most subjects die during the integration process. But twins share unusual neurological compatibility, especially when trauma bonds are involved. Your grief created the perfect psychological bridge to access Claire's consciousness." The device in his hand beeped softly, and Helen felt her breathing become labored. Whatever technology had restored her mobility was now systematically shutting down her nervous system, starting with motor functions and progressing toward autonomic responses. "The memories will survive the extraction," Dr. Carvalho said conversationally. "We've perfected the technique over decades of practice. Your consciousness will simply fade, while Claire's intelligence remains accessible for our purposes." Helen tried to speak but found her vocal cords paralyzed. Through Claire's borrowed awareness, she could feel her sister's helpless rage at being used even in death, her memories harvested like organs from a corpse. The sanctuary around them, with its ancient stones and sacred atmosphere, had become a technological abattoir where the dead were processed for their secrets. One of the suited figures approached with a metallic briefcase, its contents hidden but obviously specialized equipment. Helen recognized the efficient brutality from Claire's memories. These people had performed this procedure many times before, in many locations. The sanctuary was just one facility in a global network of memory harvesting operations. Her phone, fallen from her jacket during the collapse, buzzed with incoming messages. Through increasingly dim vision, Helen could see notifications from news outlets, social media platforms, investigative journalists. Video of her miracle was already spreading across the internet, generating the exact attention that made her eliminator's work more urgent. But attention also meant witnesses, and witnesses meant that when Helen Moreau disappeared from this ancient sanctuary, people would notice. Questions would be asked that might prove harder to silence than 2 French sisters who had stumbled onto inconvenient truths. Dr. Carvalho knelt beside her with clinical precision, the briefcase opening to reveal instruments that belonged in neither churches nor hospitals. "Any final words, Miss Moreau?" "They'll be added to our files." Helen's lips moved soundlessly, but her eyes held 3 years of accumulated fury and the terrible knowledge that her sister's sacrifice was about to become meaningless. The extraction began. The neural probe pierced Helen's scalp with surgical precision, but instead of the expected agony, she felt something impossible, Claire's consciousness pushing back. Not just memories now, but her sister's will, 3 years of accumulated rage channeled through the same psychic bridge that had allowed the memory transfer. "Fight!" Claire's voice echoed inside her mind, clear as spoken words. "They need us alive for extraction. That's our advantage." Helen's eyes snapped open as understanding flooded through her. The eclipse hadn't just enabled memory transfer, it had created a genuine fusion of consciousness. She wasn't simply accessing Claire's recollections. Her sister's mind was actively present, sharing the same neural pathways that Dr. Carvalho's technology was trying to map. "Impossible," he muttered, staring at readings on a handheld monitor. "The consciousness markers are overlapping, 2 distinct patterns occupying the same brain space." Helen felt Claire's knowledge flowing through her, not fragmented memories but complete understanding of their father's operation, the conspiracy's true scope, and most importantly, its vulnerability. Their surveillance network was vast but centralized. Every facility, every operation, every harvested memory was stored in a single quantum server farm that Claire had spent months trying to locate. "Prague," Claire whispered through their shared mind. "Subsection 7, beneath the old cathedral, Every secret they've stolen, every life they've taken for information, all of it stored in one place. But that wasn't the revelation that shifted everything. Through Claire's consciousness, Helen suddenly understood the true nature of what was happening to her. The neural modifications, the temporary paralysis, the careful psychological manipulation, it was all familiar because Claire had experienced identical procedures. Her sister hadn't died in the car accident. "You took her," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute certainty. "Claire survived the crash. You harvested her memories while she was still alive." Dr. Carvalho's hand froze on the neural probe. Around them, the suited figures shifted nervously, hands moving toward concealed weapons. "Impossible. Our records clearly show." "Your records show what you wanted Papa to believe." Helen felt Claire's presence growing stronger, as if the truth itself was providing energy. "But Claire remembers dying on your table, not in twisted metal. She remembers weeks of extraction procedures. She remembers you promising Papa that his surviving daughter would never know what really happened." The monitor in Dr. Carvalho's hands began emitting rapid beeping sounds. Helen could see her own brain activity displayed on the screen, two distinct consciousness patterns intertwined so completely that separation would be impossible without destroying both. 3 years, Helen continued, each word weighted with combined grief and fury. 3 years of survivor's guilt for an accident that never killed her. 3 years of believing I lost my sister, while you kept her alive in a laboratory, harvesting her memories piece by piece until there was nothing left. Dr. Carvalho stepped backward, his clinical composure finally cracking. The integration process shouldn't allow for this level of cognitive reconstruction. The secondary consciousness should be subordinate, accessible but not autonomous. But Helen wasn't listening to his technical protestations. Through Claire's memories, she was seeing the truth about the sanctuary itself, about every miracle that had occurred here over the decades. The Virgin Mary statue wasn't a conduit for divine grace. It was a quantum memory storage device containing the consciousness fragments of everyone who had died protecting inconvenient secrets. Every person who had touched that stone during an eclipse hadn't been healed by faith. They'd been temporarily merged with the memories of the dead, their own consciousness serving as a buffer while extraction procedures harvested information that powerful people wanted buried. "You're all here," she breathed, suddenly aware of other presences pressing at the edges of her mind. Everyone who ever knew too much, everyone who died protecting the truth. You didn't destroy their memories, you trapped them. The revelation wasn't just personal, it was cosmic in scope. The sanctuary wasn't one facility in a global network. It was the central hub, the repository where centuries of harvested consciousness had been accumulated. The eclipse that had triggered her miracle was actually a scheduled data transfer, uploading stored memories to quantum servers where they could be accessed by intelligence agencies, criminal organizations, and corporate interests willing to pay for secrets that died with their original owners. Helen felt Claire's consciousness merge completely with her own, no longer separate but unified. Her sister's knowledge, her investigative skills, her understanding of the conspiracy's structure, all of it became Helen's permanent possession, not through extraction but through willing integration. "That's why you need me alive," she realized, looking directly into Dr. Carvalho's increasingly panicked eyes. "Claire didn't just discover your operation. She hacked into it. She planted a virus in your quantum storage system that can only be activated by specific neural patterns, patterns that only exist when our consciousness is fully merged." The beeping from his monitor accelerated into a continuous alarm tone. "On command from me," Helen whispered, "and every secret you've ever stolen gets uploaded simultaneously to every major news outlet on Earth." Everything had shifted. The victim had become the weapon. Dr. Carvalho's device clattered to the stone floor as his hands shook, the neural probe retracting with a mechanical whine. Around the courtyard, the suited figures raised their weapons, but Helen could see uncertainty in their postures. They'd been trained to eliminate witnesses, not to navigate a situation where killing their target would trigger the very exposure they were trying to prevent. "You're bluffing," Dr. Carvalho said, but his voice carried no conviction. The monitor in his other hand continued its frantic alarm as Helen's unified consciousness created patterns his equipment had never registered. The virus would require quantum-level authentication protocols. No civilian could. Claire wasn't a civilian. Helen felt strength returning to her limbs as her sister's technical knowledge flooded through their merged awareness. She was a cryptography specialist for Europol before she started investigating Papa's contracts. She knew your systems better than you thought. Through Claire's memories, Helen could see the months of careful infiltration her sister had orchestrated, not just following financial records, but systematically penetrating the digital infrastructure of the memory harvesting operation. Claire had spent weeks learning the sanctuary's true purpose before the staged accident, uploading dormant code fragments that would remain undetectable, until triggered by the specific neurological resonance of their combined consciousness. The irony was perfect. The Eclipse technology they'd used to trap her had given her the exact tool needed to destroy them. "The upload sequence is already beginning," Helen continued, feeling the virus stirring to life in quantum servers hundreds of miles away. Every politician's bribe, every corporate cover-up, every murder disguised as suicide, all of it documented by the people you killed to keep it secret. Their memories are about to become public record. Dr. Carvalho frantically typed commands into his tablet, but Helen could see through Claire's technical understanding that he was too late. The virus wasn't just releasing information, it was simultaneously corrupting the extraction equipment throughout their global network, ensuring that no more memories could be harvested while the revelations spread across every major news platform simultaneously. "Stop this," he demanded, dropping his scientific pretense entirely. "You don't understand the consequences. Some secrets exist for legitimate reasons. Intelligence operations, national security, diplomatic. Then you should have limited yourselves to legitimate targets." Helen pulled herself upright against the Virgin Mary statue, her legs trembling but supporting her weight. "Instead, you murdered children who discovered construction fraud. You harvested the memories of investigative journalists, human rights activists, whistleblowers trying to protect people. The suited figures were receiving rapid communications through their earpieces, their formation beginning to collapse as orders conflicted with the evolving situation. Helen realized that their handlers were facing an impossible choice: let the information release proceed or eliminate her and guarantee that Claire's virus would complete its upload without any possibility of intervention. Father Antonio stirred near the altar, his breathing shallow but steady. Helen felt a surge of relief that the priest had survived, but also growing urgency. The longer this standoff continued, the more likely it became that Dr. Carvalho would decide mass casualties were acceptable losses. "There's a third option," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Claire's virus has a manual termination sequence, but it requires voluntary cooperation from both our consciousness patterns. Stop the suppression field. Let me walk out of here, and I'll consider halting the upload." It was a bluff built on a foundation of truth. The virus did have termination protocols, but Helen had no intention of using them. Through Claire's memories, she'd seen too much suffering, too many lives destroyed for the sake of protecting powerful people's secrets. The world deserved to know what had been stolen from the dead, but the bluff bought her time. Dr. Carvalho hesitated, clearly weighing his options while his monitor showed the quantum servers, continuing their systematic purge. The suited figures held their positions, awaiting orders that weren't coming. In that moment of hesitation, Helen heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching the sanctuary, multiple engines moving fast along the mountain roads. She recognized the tactical timing from Claire's law enforcement experience. Someone had been monitoring the situation and was bringing reinforcements. "Your window is closing," she told Dr. Carvalho. "Whatever you're going to decide, decide quickly." Dr. Carvalho's expression shifted from panic to cold calculation. He reached for a backup device, smaller than the neural suppressor, but obviously more dangerous. If we can't extract the memories cleanly, we'll settle for ensuring they can't be transmitted. Helen felt Claire's consciousness surge protectively around her own, their unified presence, creating patterns that made her brain activity nearly impossible to target precisely. But she also understood that Dr. Carvalho had moved beyond caring about precision. He was preparing to scramble her neural pathways entirely, accepting the loss of Claire's intelligence in exchange for preventing its release. The approaching vehicles were closer now, their engines echoing off the sanctuary walls. Helen smiled, feeling her sister's satisfaction merge with her own determination. The cavalry was coming, and the secrets of the dead would finally have their day in the light. The vehicles burst through the sanctuary gates with tactical precision. 3 black SUVs followed by what Helen recognized from Claire's memories as Portuguese special police units. Dr. Carvalho's backup device froze halfway to activation as armed figures poured into the ancient courtyard, their movements coordinated with military efficiency. "Drop your weapons!" the command echoed in Portuguese, then English, then French. Helen felt Claire's satisfaction as she recognized the voice. Inspector Miguel Santos, Claire's former contact at Europol, who had been investigating the same financial irregularities 3 years ago. The suited figures hesitated, caught between their original orders and the rapidly deteriorating tactical situation. Dr. Carvalho's hand trembled on his device, but Helen could see the cold mathematics playing out behind his eyes. Too many witnesses now, too much exposure. The situation had moved beyond salvage into damage control. "Inspector Santos," Dr. Carvalho called out with forced calm, raising his empty hand while keeping the neural disruptor concealed. "There's been a misunderstanding. Miss Moreau suffered a medical emergency during her pilgrimage. We're providing emergency assistance." But Helen was already moving, Claire's law enforcement instincts guiding her steps toward the approaching officers. Her legs still felt uncertain beneath her, but each stride carried 3 years of accumulated purpose. She wouldn't let them spin this into another cover-up, another convenient accident. "Miguel!" she called out, her voice carrying Claire's confidence and knowledge. "The quantum servers, they're purging evidence right now. You need to preserve the data streams before they can complete the wipe." Dr. Carvalho's composure finally shattered completely. She's delusional. The neural trauma from her accident has created elaborate paranoid fantasies. "About Prague?" Helen interrupted, feeling Claire's memories providing exact details. "Subsection 7, beneath the cathedral? About the financial transfers from Moreau Construction to Black Horizon Industries? About the memory extraction facilities operating under humanitarian cover throughout Europe?" Inspector Santos's expression shifted from confusion to sharp recognition. These weren't the ramblings of a traumatized pilgrim. These were specific intelligence details that connected to investigations spanning multiple jurisdictions. Helen felt the moment when Dr. Carvalho made his final calculation. His finger moved toward the activation switch on his concealed device, accepting that if he couldn't silence her permanently, he could at least scramble her memories enough to discredit any testimony. But Claire's consciousness was ready. Through their merged awareness, Helen anticipated the neural attack and dropped behind the Virgin Mary statue just as electromagnetic pulses erupted from the device. The ancient stone absorbed most of the energy, but she felt the edges of the field disrupting her thoughts, trying to separate her consciousness from her sister's. "Hold on," Claire's voice whispered through the interference. "The virus is almost complete. Just a few more seconds." The suited figures opened fire as Inspector Santos's team responded with overwhelming force. Helen pressed herself against the base of the statue, feeling centuries-old stone chips rain down around her as bullets sparked off the ancient Virgin's weathered surface. The irony wasn't lost on her. Seeking protection behind the same statue that had been used to trap the memories of the dead. Father Antonio crawled toward the altar, calling out prayers that mixed Portuguese with Latin. But Helen could see through Claire's awareness that the priest understood more than he'd revealed. His sanctuary had been compromised for decades. its sacred purpose corrupted by the very people he'd trusted to maintain it. "The upload is complete," Helen announced as the electromagnetic interference faded. Around the courtyard, tactical communications erupted as news feeds began displaying the first leaked document simultaneously across multiple platforms. Decades of harvested memories were becoming public record in real time. Dr. Carvalho's device sparked and died, overwhelmed by feedback from quantum servers that were now broadcasting rather than storing their contents. His face went pale as he realized the magnitude of what was being released. Not just individual secrets, but the entire operational structure of memory harvesting programs spanning 5 continents. "You've destroyed everything," he whispered, staring at Helen with something approaching awe. 40 years of intelligence gathering, national security assets, diplomatic protections. You've just exposed operations that keep governments stable. Helen stood slowly, feeling Claire's presence settle into permanent unity with her own consciousness. The miracle hadn't been divine intervention. It had been her sister's final gift, the completion of an investigation that had cost both their lives in different ways. "Then maybe those governments deserve to fall," she replied, walking toward Inspector Santos with steady steps. Her legs were strong now, carrying not just her own weight, but the accumulated purpose of everyone whose memories had been stolen and silenced. Behind her, the Virgin Mary statue stood unchanged, its stone hand still extended toward supplicants. But Helen knew that the quantum storage devices hidden within its base were now empty, their precious cargo of harvested consciousness finally free. The road back to truth had been longer than she'd imagined, but she'd traveled it with her sister's spirit as guide. Now came the reckoning. Inspector Santos moved across the courtyard with methodical efficiency, his team securing the surrendered operatives while Helen stood amidst the chaos, feeling the weight of what she'd unleashed settling into her bones. The gunfire had stopped, but the real battle was just beginning, not here in this ancient sanctuary, but in newsrooms, government offices and boardrooms across 5 continents, where the first leaked documents were already causing seismic tremors. Dr. Carvalho remained motionless beside his destroyed equipment, his clinical detachment replaced by something approaching shell shock. Around the world, quantum servers were hemorrhaging information faster than any damage control team could contain. Each revelation exposed another layer of the conspiracy, another network of harvested memories that had been commodified and traded like precious resources. "Miss Moreau," Inspector Santos approached cautiously, his weapon lowered but ready. "Can you verify your identity? We need to understand what exactly happened here." Helen felt Claire's law enforcement instincts guide her response, but something deeper was stirring in her consciousness. Through their merged awareness, she was becoming aware of other presences, not just her sister's memories, but fragments of every person whose consciousness had been stored in the sanctuary's quantum devices. Hundreds of voices, each carrying pieces of truth that powerful people had killed to suppress. "I'm Helen Moreau," she replied steadily, "but I'm also carrying the memories of my sister Claire, and through her, the experiences of everyone who died protecting inconvenient secrets. The miracle wasn't divine intervention, Inspector, it was a data transfer." As she spoke, her phone buzzed with alerts from news platforms worldwide. The leaked information was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, creating a cascade effect as each revelation prompted investigation into related operations. Financial networks that had seemed legitimate were being exposed as money laundering schemes. Humanitarian organizations revealed as fronts for intelligence gathering. Politicians, corporate executives, and criminal kingpins all connected by their willingness to pay for secrets stolen from the dead. But Helen was beginning to understand that the information leak was only the first phase of Claire's plan. Through her sister's memories, she could see the deeper strategy. The virus hadn't just released existing data, it had corrupted the extraction equipment throughout the global network, ensuring that no more memories could be harvested while also creating a trail that would lead investigators to every facility, every operation, every person involved in the conspiracy. Father Antonio struggled to his feet near the altar, his face bearing the weight of complicity he could no longer deny. "I thought I was protecting pilgrims," he whispered, loud enough for Helen to hear. "They told me the technology-enhanced prayer helped people connect with divine presence. I never knew." "You suspected," Helen replied, not unkindly. "Claire's memories show you asking questions, expressing doubts, but the funding was too important to your community to risk losing." The priest's shoulders sagged with acknowledgement. Like so many others, he'd allowed willful ignorance to excuse participation in something he'd known wasn't entirely legitimate. Dr. Carvalho finally spoke, his voice carrying exhausted defeat. "You don't understand the full consequences of what you've done. Some of those memories contained information about ongoing operations, human trafficking networks, terrorist cells, organized crime syndicates. Intelligence agencies used that stolen consciousness to save lives." Helen felt Claire's response rise through their shared awareness, cold and uncompromising. Then they should have obtained that intelligence through legal channels. Instead, they murdered innocent people and harvested their memories like some kind of twisted crop. Through the growing crowd of law enforcement personnel, Helen spotted a familiar face, her father, Papa, being escorted in restraints toward one of the police vehicles. His construction company hadn't just built the sanctuary's hidden infrastructure, he'd been the primary contractor for facilities across Europe accepting payment for silence about the quantum technology being installed beneath sacred spaces. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and Helen saw in his expression the exact moment he realized that both his daughters knew the truth. Claire's investigation had started with irregularities in his financial records, but it had uncovered something so much larger that their family's tragedy had become just one small piece of a global conspiracy. "Papa!" she called out, her voice carrying both Claire's anger and her own desperate need for explanation. "Did you know what would happen to us? Did you know they would come for Claire when she got too close to the truth?" His response was a barely audible whisper that somehow carried across the chaos. "I thought money would protect you both. I thought if I gave them what they wanted, they would leave my family alone." But money had never been protection. It had been the very thing that made them targets. Papa's construction company had access to the physical infrastructure of the memory harvesting operation, making his daughters dangerous simply by association. Claire's investigation had turned potential risk into active threat, and Helen's miraculous recovery had made her the key to unlocking everything. Now, standing in the sanctuary where her sister's consciousness had been trapped for 3 years, Helen understood that the miracle wasn't complete. The information had been released, the immediate conspiracy exposed, but the deeper challenge was just beginning. She had to decide what to do with the accumulated memories of hundreds of victims, now living permanently within her consciousness. Each one deserved justice. Each one carried truths that demanded telling. The reckoning had begun, but Helen was no longer just a victim seeking answers. She had become the living repository of everyone the conspiracy had silenced, and their combined voices would not be ignored. The first shot came from behind the police line. Helen spun toward the sound, Claire's tactical instincts screaming warnings through their merged consciousness. Inspector Santos dropped to one knee, his sidearm already drawn as chaos erupted across the courtyard. But this wasn't random violence. Through the swirling confusion, Helen spotted the shooter's position and felt her blood turn to ice. Dr. Carvalho's backup device hadn't been destroyed after all. In his hand was a modified neural disruptor, smaller but infinitely more dangerous than the equipment scattered around the altar. Not designed for extraction or suppression, designed for termination. "Final option," he called out with eerie calm, his clinical detachment fully restored. "If we cannot contain the leak, we eliminate the source entirely." Helen felt hundreds of consciousnesses within her mind recoil in shared terror. The harvested memories understood what that device represented, not just her death, but the permanent destruction of everyone whose truth she carried. All those silenced voices would be lost forever. But Claire's presence surged protectively around her thoughts, and Helen realized her sister had been preparing for this moment. The virus hadn't just corrupted extraction equipment worldwide, it had created a backup network, storing copies of every harvested memory across distributed servers that no single point of failure could destroy. "You're too late," Helen said, stepping forward despite Inspector Santos's shouted warnings. "Even killing me won't stop what's already been released. Claire made sure of that." Dr. Carvalho's finger hovered over the activation trigger. "Perhaps. But you're the primary node, the living conduit through which the memories achieve coherence. Without you, they become fragments, useful data, but not dangerous testimony." Around them, the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The remaining operatives had shed any pretense of medical assistance, revealing military-grade weapons that made Inspector Santos's police units look dangerously outmatched. This had always been their contingency plan. If exposure became inevitable, eliminate all witnesses and claim the sanctuary had been attacked by extremists. Helen felt Claire's consciousness merge completely with her own, their two minds becoming one unified entity that could process tactical information with superhuman clarity. She could see the positioning of every operative, anticipate their movements, understand the strategic calculations playing out in real time. But more than that, she could feel the other memories stirring within her consciousness, not just passive observers, but active participants. Victims of the conspiracy who had carried their own skills in life, intelligence officers, investigative journalists, forensic accountants, even military strategists. Their combined expertise was becoming available to her, hundreds of different perspectives, analyzing the confrontation from every possible angle. "You're not alone," Claire's voice whispered through the merged awareness. "You've never been alone. All of us are here with you." Dr. Carvalho raised the neural disruptor, its targeting system locking onto Helen's brain patterns. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, she felt the accumulated knowledge of the dead guiding her movements. Not supernatural intervention, simply the tactical expertise of people who had faced similar life-or-death moments and survived long enough to be murdered for their secrets. She dropped and rolled behind the Virgin Mary statue just as electromagnetic death erupted from the device. Ancient stone absorbed most of the pulse, but she felt the edges of the field attempting to penetrate her consciousness, seeking to unweave the delicate patterns that held hundreds of memories in stable configuration. The disruptor recharged with a high-pitched whine, preparing for a second shot that would penetrate any cover. But Helen was already moving, using Claire's law enforcement training, combined with tactical knowledge from a dozen other victims, to plot an approach vector that exploited the operative's positioning. Inspector Santos's team engaged the remaining hostiles with concentrated fire, but Helen could see through multiple tactical perspectives that they were being systematically outmaneuvered. Dr. Carvalho had chosen his ground well. The sanctuary's layout provided excellent cover for defenders while limiting approach options for assault teams. As she circled toward his position, Helen felt something unprecedented happening within her consciousness. The harvested memories weren't just providing knowledge, they were beginning to coordinate, their individual skills combining into something greater than their sum. Like a distributed intelligence network, each consciousness contributing its expertise toward a unified objective. "We've been waiting 3 years for this moment," came a voice she didn't recognize. One of the other victims, speaking through Claire's connection. "All of us. Every person he silenced. Today we get our reckoning." Dr. Carvalho spun toward her approach, the neural disruptor tracking her movement with deadly precision. But Helen was no longer just herself, or even just herself and Claire. She had become the living embodiment of everyone the conspiracy had murdered, their combined will focused on a single moment of justice. The device fired at point-blank range, electromagnetic death reaching for her consciousness with surgical precision, and Helen smiled as hundreds of voices rose in unified defiance, refusing to be silenced again. The sacrifice, The electromagnetic pulse tore through Helen's consciousness like liquid fire, but instead of fragmenting her thoughts, it encountered something unprecedented, a unified wall of memory that refused to disperse. Hundreds of harvested consciousnesses linked together in defiant solidarity, their combined will absorbing the device's destructive energy and transforming it into something else entirely. Helen felt herself becoming translucent, her physical form wavering as the boundary between living flesh and stored memory began to dissolve. This was the choice Claire had always intended her to make, she realized with crystalline clarity. Not healing, not even justice. Transcendence. Helen! Inspector Santos's voice seemed to come from very far away as she stepped through the electromagnetic field toward Dr. Carvalho. The neural disruptor's second pulse passed harmlessly through her increasingly ethereal form, its targeting systems unable to lock onto consciousness that existed simultaneously in quantum storage and biological neural networks. But she could feel the cost of this transformation burning through her awareness. To become the permanent guardian of these harvested memories meant surrendering her claim to purely human existence. She would live, but never again, as simply Helen Moreau. Her consciousness would be forever intertwined with hundreds of others, a living archive of everyone the conspiracy had silenced. Claire's presence embraced her through the transition, offering comfort and confirmation. This is what I've been preparing you for, not revenge, preservation. Someone has to remember for all of us. Dr. Carvalho stumbled backward as Helen approached, his clinical facade finally cracking entirely. Impossible. The human mind can't maintain coherent integration with that volume of foreign consciousness. You should be experiencing complete psychological dissolution. I'm not just human anymore, Helen replied, her voice carrying harmonic overtones from dozens of other speakers. I'm what you made me when you murdered my sister and trapped her memories in this place. I'm every secret you tried to bury, every truth you thought could be contained. Around the courtyard, the tactical engagement was ending as Inspector Santos's reinforcements overwhelmed the remaining operatives. But Helen barely registered the gunfire and shouted commands. Her attention was focused on the deeper transformation occurring within the sanctuary itself. The quantum storage devices embedded throughout the ancient structure were responding to her metamorphosis, their data streams flowing through her consciousness in ways their designers had never intended. She wasn't just accessing the harvested memories, she was becoming their permanent custodian, ensuring they could never again be commodified or suppressed. But the weight of that responsibility was staggering. Each consciousness carried not just their individual trauma, but their final moments of terror as their memories were extracted, their deaths, their desperate last thoughts about family, about unfinished work, about truths they'd tried to protect. Helen felt all of it flowing into her awareness, threatening to drown her individual identity in an ocean of accumulated grief. "You don't have to carry this alone," Claire whispered, her presence strengthening within the merge. "We're here with you, all of us. The burden is shared now." Through tears she didn't remember shedding, Helen saw her father being loaded into a police transport, his construction empire already collapsing as investigators traced the infrastructure he'd built for memory harvesting facilities. Papa had thought money could protect his family, but his willingness to build cages for stolen souls had doomed them all. She wanted to call out to him, to offer some final word of forgiveness or understanding. But when she opened her mouth, dozens of voices emerged simultaneously, victims of the conspiracy demanding acknowledgement, truth-tellers refusing to be silenced any longer. Her individual identity was dissolving into something larger and more terrible than she'd imagined possible. Father Antonio approached cautiously, his weathered face bearing the weight of complicity he could no longer deny. "Miss Moreau." "Helen, what have you become?" "Guardian," she replied, the word carrying certainty that surprised her. "Someone who remembers what others tried to forget." Dr. Carvalho's neural disruptor finally powered down completely, its circuitry overloaded by energies it was never designed to process. He stared at Helen with something approaching scientific fascination, even as Inspector Santos's officers moved to restrain him. "The integration shouldn't be stable," he murmured. "Human consciousness can't maintain that level of parallel processing without complete personality dissolution. Unless—" his eyes widened with terrible understanding. "You're not trying to remain purely human, are you? You're allowing yourself to become something new." Helen nodded slowly, feeling her physical form solidifying again as the transformation reached equilibrium. She remained recognizably herself, but carried within her consciousness the permanent presence of everyone whose memories had been harvested. Their voices, their knowledge, their unfinished business, all of it now part of her essential being. The miracle at the sanctuary of Our Lady of Sorrows hadn't been divine intervention after all. It had been her sister's final investigation, a 3-year preparation for this moment when Helen would choose to sacrifice her individual humanity to become something unprecedented, a living memorial to everyone the powerful had tried to erase. She could walk again, yes, but she would carry the memories of hundreds forever. The reckoning was complete. But Helen's real journey was just beginning, the resolution. The silence that followed was more profound than any Helen had ever experienced. Not the absence of sound. Inspector Santos's officers were still securing the scene, radios crackling with reports, distant sirens wailing as additional emergency services converged on the sanctuary. But beneath the chaos lay a deeper quiet, the settling that comes when a storm finally exhausts itself. Helen stood motionless beside the Virgin Mary statue, feeling the hundreds of consciousnesses within her mind gradually finding their equilibrium. The violent integration was complete, but the aftermath felt like learning to breathe underwater. Each thought now carried harmonic resonances from dozens of other minds. Every emotion filtered through the accumulated experiences of people she'd never met, but whose memories she would carry forever. Inspector Santos approached cautiously, his weapon holstered, but his posture still tense. "Helen, can you hear me?" "We can hear you," she replied, then caught herself. The pronoun shift wasn't intentional, it simply felt more accurate. When she spoke, she carried the voices of everyone whose consciousness had been harvested by the conspiracy. Their individual perspectives might be integrated now, but they remained distinct presences within her awareness. "We need to get you medical attention," Santos continued, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure what kind of medical attention could address her condition. "Dr. Carvalho mentioned something about parallel processing, consciousness integration. There might be neurological damage we can't see." Helen almost smiled at that. Damage implied something broken, but what had happened to her felt more like evolution. Painful, terrifying evolution that had cost her individual humanity, but evolution nonetheless. She could perceive the world through hundreds of different experiential frameworks simultaneously, process information with the combined analytical capabilities of journalists, scientists, intelligence officers, and scholars. But she could also feel their grief, all of it. The accumulated sorrow of people murdered for their inconvenient truths now lived permanently within her consciousness. A weight that made her previous survivors' guilt seem trivial by comparison. Claire's presence stirred within the merge, offering comfort through their shared awareness. "The pain gets easier to carry when it's distributed. We're all here to help you bear it." Dr. Carvalho was being loaded into an armored transport, his hands secured behind his back with military-grade restraints. As he passed near Helen, he paused to study her with the same clinical fascination that had driven his research. "You should be catatonic," he said matter-of-factly. "The human brain isn't designed to maintain stable integration with that volume of foreign consciousness. Whatever you've become, it represents a fundamental alteration in the nature of human cognition itself." "Maybe that's what the world needs," Helen replied. "Someone who can't forget, someone who carries all the secrets that powerful people tried to bury." His laugh held no humor. "You think you've won something here? This was one facility, one node in a network that spans continents. The technology will be rebuilt, the operations relocated. You've inconvenienced us, nothing more." But Helen could feel Claire's satisfaction rippling through their shared consciousness, along with similar emotions from dozens of other integrated memories. Her sister's virus hadn't just corrupted the equipment at this sanctuary, it had propagated through the global network, carrying the complete archive of harvested memories to journalists, intelligence agencies, and human rights organizations worldwide. The conspiracy's greatest strength had become its weakness. By connecting their facilities through quantum-encrypted networks, they created the perfect distribution system for their own exposure. Father Antonio was kneeling beside the Virgin Mary statue, his weathered hands tracing the ancient stone where Helen had first touched it 3 years ago. His prayers were barely audible, but she could sense the profound guilt radiating from him. He'd known something was wrong with the miracles at his sanctuary, but the funding had been too important to his community to question too closely. "Father," Helen called softly, approaching him with careful steps. Her physical coordination was still adjusting to the integration, her motor functions guided by muscle memories that weren't entirely her own. He looked up at her with eyes full of tears. "I failed them all, didn't I? Every pilgrim who came here seeking genuine healing, and I let them be harvested." "You let yourself be deceived," she corrected gently. But the deception was sophisticated, designed by people who understood exactly how to exploit faith and hope. Claire's memories showed dozens of religious leaders across Europe who fell for similar manipulations. Through the crowd of law enforcement personnel, Helen spotted her father being escorted to a separate transport. Papa's construction empire was already unraveling as investigators traced the infrastructure he'd built for memory harvesting facilities across multiple countries. But seeing him now, shoulders slumped in defeat, she felt only pity. Their eyes met one final time across the courtyard. In his expression, she saw the exact moment he understood that both his daughters knew everything, the money, the silence, the willful blindness that had made their family complicit in something monstrous. Helen wanted to call out to him, to offer some word of forgiveness or understanding. But when she opened her mouth, she realized that individual mercy was no longer hers to give. She carried the voices of hundreds of victims now, and they deserved justice more than her father deserved absolution. The reckoning was complete, but Helen's transformation had created something unprecedented, a living memorial that could never be silenced, never be corrupted, never be bought. She would spend the rest of her life ensuring that the dead were remembered. The return. 6 months later, Helen stood at the entrance to the École de Ballet de Paris, her legs steady beneath her but her hands trembling as she watched young dancers through the studio windows. The familiar sound of piano accompaniment and the sharp calls of instructors speaking in French drifted through the glass, carrying her back to memories that felt both intimately hers and impossibly distant. She had returned to Paris not as the girl who had left 3 years ago in a wheelchair, broken by grief and survivor's guilt, but as something unprecedented, a living archive of stolen souls who refused to remain silent. The hundreds of consciousnesses integrated within her mind stirred gently as she approached the building, their collective presence offering support she still found difficult to accept. "You're allowed to reclaim pieces of who you were," Claire whispered through their shared awareness. "Carrying us doesn't mean losing yourself completely." But Helen wasn't certain that was true. When she looked in mirrors now, her reflection seemed to flicker with the faces of others. Journalists who had died protecting sources, scientists silenced for inconvenient discoveries, intelligence officers eliminated for digging too deep. Their experiences had become hers, their skills and knowledge permanently accessible, but at the cost of simple individual existence. The studio door opened, and Madame Dubois emerged, her severe expression softening with recognition and something approaching disbelief. Helen's former ballet instructor had aged visibly in 3 years, her silver hair now completely white, her posture slightly stooped, but her eyes remained sharp with the critical assessment that had once terrified Helen as a student. "Mon Dieu, Helen," she breathed in accented English, "the news reports. the stories about what happened in Portugal. We thought you were dead. Then we heard you could walk again, but nobody knew where you had gone. I needed time, Helen replied carefully. Speaking had become complex. She had to consciously filter her responses to ensure only her own voice emerged, not the chorus of others who carried opinions about every subject imaginable. Time to understand what I've become. Madame Dubois studied her with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading the bodies and souls of dancers. Helen could see the moment she recognized that something fundamental had changed, something that went far beyond physical healing. You moved differently, the instructor observed. Not just because of the accident. There's something else, like you're carrying more weight than before. Helen almost smiled at the accuracy of that assessment. She carried the weight of hundreds of memories, their accumulated grief and unfinished business a constant presence in her consciousness. But she also carried their strength, their expertise, their determination to ensure that truth could never again be so easily suppressed. I came to say goodbye, Helen said, to the person I was here, before the accident, before... She gestured vaguely, unsure how to explain the magnitude of what had happened at the sanctuary. Before everything changed. But Madame Dubois was already shaking her head. No, you did not come here to say goodbye. You came because dance was how you first learned to speak with your body, and now you need to learn that language again. Through the studio windows, Helen watched a young dancer, perhaps 17, with dark hair pulled into the same severe bun she had once worn, struggling with a particularly difficult sequence. The girl's frustration was visible in every line of her body, the same desperate perfectionism that had once driven Helen to practice until her feet bled. Within her integrated consciousness, Helen felt Claire's presence strengthen, along with something else, the memory of another dancer whose consciousness had been harvested by the conspiracy. Maria Santos, a flamenco performer from Seville who had been investigating corruption in arts funding before her memories were stolen, and her body found floating in the Guadalquivir River. Show her, Maria's voice whispered through the merge. Show her what dance looks like when it carries the stories of the silenced. Almost without conscious decision, Helen found herself entering the studio. The students paused in their practice, staring at the young woman whose survival had been international news for months. But Helen ignored their attention, moving to the center of the floor where afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows created the same patterns she remembered from her years of training. She began to move, and it was both exactly and nothing like the ballet she had once performed. Her technique remained flawless, muscle memory preserved despite 3 years of paralysis, but the emotional content had been transformed entirely. She danced not just her own story now, but the stories of everyone whose consciousness she carried. Their joy, their terror, their defiant refusal to be forgotten flowed through movements that had never been choreographed but felt inevitable. The studio fell completely silent as Helen's improvised memorial took shape. She was no longer performing for judges or audiences, but dancing the living history of people who had died protecting truth. Each leap carried the hope of scientists silenced for inconvenient research. Each turn embodied the determination of journalists who had refused to be bought. Each gesture spoke for voices that had been stolen but never truly silenced. When the dance ended, Helen found herself surrounded by tears, from the students, from Madame Dubois, and from her own eyes. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of recognition, of understanding that art could become something more than entertainment when it carried the weight of witness. She had returned to her world, but as something entirely new, the new beginning. Helen remained still in the center of the studio as the last echoes of her improvised memorial faded into silence. The afternoon light had shifted during her dance, casting longer shadows across the polished floor where she had once trained with singular focus on technical perfection. Now, surrounded by the awed faces of students and the knowing expression of Madame Dubois, she understood that this moment marked not just a return, but a complete transformation of purpose. The young dancer who had been struggling with her sequence approached hesitantly, her eyes wide with something between reverence and curiosity. "How did you—" "That wasn't any choreography I've ever seen, but it felt like it told a complete story. Stories, actually. Like you were dancing for more than just yourself." Helen felt Claire's presence stir within their shared consciousness, along with Maria Santos and dozens of others whose memories had witnessed the power of art to preserve truth when all other forms of record-keeping failed. Their collective knowledge flowed through her awareness, centuries of stories about dancers, musicians, writers and artists who had hidden messages of resistance in their work, who had spoken for the silenced when speaking directly meant death. "I am dancing for more than myself," Helen replied gently. "I carry the stories of people who can't tell them anymore. That's what I've become." Madame Dubois moved closer, her trained eye still analyzing the residual energy that lingered in Helen's posture. "This is why you returned, not to reclaim your old life, but to understand how your art can serve your new purpose." Through the studio windows, Helen could see the bustling streets of Paris beyond, a world that had no idea how close it had come to losing its capacity for truth entirely. The conspiracy's memory harvesting network had been exposed 6 months ago, leading to arrests across multiple continents and the liberation of thousands of stolen consciousnesses. But the technology still existed, and Helen knew from the integrated memories she carried that other organizations would attempt to rebuild what had been destroyed. She would need to be ready. They all would. "The dance changes everything," whispered a voice Helen recognized as Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist whose research into consciousness transfer had been stolen before her murder. "Art creates connections that pure information cannot. You can help people understand what we experienced, what we learned, in ways that testimony and documents never could." Over the following weeks, Helen established a new routine that felt both familiar and entirely unprecedented. She rented a small studio in Montmartre, spending her mornings developing what she came to think of as memorial choreography, dances that preserved and transmitted the experiences of those whose memories she carried. Each piece told specific stories of truth-seekers who had been silenced, their investigations and discoveries translated into movement that audiences could feel in their bodies, rather than simply process intellectually. Word spread quietly through artistic communities across Europe. Helen's performances weren't advertised in traditional venues. Instead, they took place in small galleries, community centers, university lecture halls. Journalists who had survived the conspiracy's attacks came to witness the stories of colleagues who hadn't. Scientists gathered to see their murdered peers' research translated into forms that transcended academic papers. Families of the disappeared found comfort in knowing their loved ones' work lived on through Helen's integrated consciousness. But the most profound changes happened during Helen's private practice sessions, when she allowed the full chorus of voices within her mind to guide her movement. These weren't performances for others. They were conversations with the dead, collaborative creations that helped her understand the magnitude of what she had become. Claire's presence had grown stronger rather than weaker over the months, their twin connection now enhanced by the deep integration that had saved Helen's sanity during the initial merge. Together, they had developed a way of existing that honored both their individual identities and their shared purpose. "We're not replacing the people we carry," Claire observed during one such session, her consciousness flowing through movements that had become as natural as breathing. "We're giving them continuation, a way to keep working toward the justice they died seeking." On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after her transformation at the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Sorrows, Helen stood before a new audience. Members of the European Parliament's Committee investigating consciousness harvesting technologies. But instead of delivering testimony from a podium, she had been granted permission to speak through dance. As she moved through the formal chamber, her body telling the stories of corruption that spanned decades and continents, Helen felt the weight of hundreds of integrated consciousnesses settling into something that no longer felt like burden. It felt like purpose, like the completion of a promise she had made without words when she first touched the Virgin Mary's hand and accepted the responsibility of remembering. When the dance ended, and the representatives sat in stunned silence, Helen realized that her new beginning had been happening gradually all along, not as a return to who she had been, but as an evolution into who the world needed her to become. She was Helen Moreau, former ballet prodigy, survivor of tragedy, guardian of stolen memories. She was the living proof that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how powerful those who seek to silence them. She was finally, completely home.